to welcome you to our 8 things to consider for making your migration to SharePoint Online a success webinar. Thanks, Drew. I'm Walter Petrus, Operating Officer of Netwoven, and I'll be the facilitator for today's presentation. My goal is to help you get the most out of our presentation and answer your questions. A few comments about the logistics of today's webinar. We have some great speakers and a lot of content to cover in 50 minutes. We'll do the best to answer your questions throughout the presentation, or we'll post our answers to our blog at netwoven.com. If you have any questions or issues, please look at the upper right corner of your screen. You should see the GoToWebinar control panel. In that panel, you can post questions or click the hand to raise an issue, and we'll do our best to answer your questions as you go along. So please feel free to share those questions. Just a quick note about Netwoven. We're a full-service technology consulting firm. We've been fortunate to work with some of these large Fortune 1000 companies. We're founded in 2001, and we've been lucky to recruit some of the great consultants from many industries and technology firms. We feel fortunate to work with many of these firms and some of the customers on the call today. Thank you for your support. Quick highlight about our services. As many of you know, we do a lot of work in migrating to Office 365. We're doing more and more work with dynamic CRM solutions. We've been continually focusing on search-based solutions. We really do think search is, as a primary interface for a lot of intranets and extranets, has been very successful, and we'll talk a little bit about today. We continue to do staffing assistance and also an authorized seller of Mintex. So hopefully throughout the day you'll see some of the areas we focus on SharePoint Online migration. We're fortunate to have one of our distinguished engagement directors, Drew Sutton. He's been very involved with a lot of our customers. Some of you have heard his presentations before on search. And today we're going to be talking through some of the 5 key areas we focus on in our SharePoint Online migrations. Let's take a look at the agenda. So I'll cover a little bit about what we're seeing in the market, some of the industry information we have. Then we'll dive into the 5 areas. You'll see this graph on the lower right throughout the presentation to give you a sense of the areas, the sections we're in throughout the presentation. But these 5 areas are things that we feel are critically important, sometimes overlooked as you're looking at your successful migration. But we'll cover information architecture, some of the standard things in governance, some of the migration logic, how do we handle some of the migration issues, and then finally we'll talk a little bit about organizational change. We'll wrap up, and as usual, we'll have, if we have time, we'll cover expert panel for Q&A. But again, I encourage you to submit your questions as we're going along. It gives us some good feedback on how we're covering, if we're covering the topics at the right level of depth. With this background, I'll give you a little bit of market trends. Maybe Drew and I will team up here and kind of cover what we're seeing in the market. You know, I assume it's probably not unusual to see some of this feedback, but as you look at the transition from even last year, maybe not so much here in the Bay Area, but certainly in throughout the U.S., cloud's become less of a potential game changer and an essential ingredient of modern IT. Obviously, you're seeing, many of our customers are seeing the benefits of it. They're finding cutting costs. It's forcing modernization of legacy IT. It's also sometimes a better way for licensing and upgrades. So all in all, some of those have been good benefits for it. This change, though, is creating some challenges. And obviously, integration with existing systems, especially as you look at hybrid solutions or look at moving some of the workloads to the cloud, integrating to the other environments, are they available and accessible through the cloud, are critically important and a challenge. Learning curve for some organizations is tough. Again, a big investment. I appreciate many of you joining this call today. Obviously, you're already looking at cloud solutions as a viable option for you. Just a little bit on the right, you know, again, a reference, 2013, 2014 kind of comparison. You know, some of the things that jumped out at us, we see as part of our engagements. We do see changes to existing policies and procedures, but I think it's much higher than expected. Certainly you can see this jump over the last 2 years. And you can see there's differences in each of them. I would say a couple other areas, as you see a lot about policies. Management and monitoring tools, you know, still a big portion of where IT has to change. And I think Drew will cover some of those tools also as we go through here. As we look at the next slide, just a couple other highlights. Clearly you'll see that collaboration tools are, in many cases, the first application to migrate. And that's why we usually focus on SharePoint Online migrations. It's a very easier transition for customers moving to the cloud. And there's other marketing and productivity components, but collaboration in both cases here are the first two that are either planned or have already migrated when you look at some of the surveys of these enterprise companies. So that's a little bit of background about what we see going on in the market. Drew, you want to kick this off?
Sure thing. Well, thanks for the intro. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for taking the time. We are going to go ahead and get started with our first wedge of the pie and have you properly prepared for your migration to SharePoint Online. Before we actually start diving into the details here, I do want to quickly mention that part of what we're covering today is not exclusively related to SharePoint Online or the cloud. Some of the topics that we will go through do actually relate to your current and potentially future on-prem systems. However, if it's something that you have not yet considered, this is definitely your opportunity to take those points into consideration. So something to think about as we're going through the slides. The first big piece that we see in making sure that you are prepared for your migration is making sure that you've assembled the correct group of people, which in this case we're going to call a working group, in order to successfully plan and implement your migration project. The first person that we have in the diagram here is your migration expert. This is typically where an outside consultant adds value. So Netwoven offers advice in the overall strategy and process. We have packaged tools, ensure maximum migration throughput, help put together communications plans, and avoid issues and pitfalls. This migration expert is the glue between a number of the other parties that we pull together here. The next of which would be an IT collaboration manager or potentially a SharePoint administrator within your organization. This person typically understands the nuances of the source system. They have an overall understanding of the content and structure. They know who the players are, and they understand the areas in your source system where complexity may arise. And many times they're also very much involved in adoption, planning, and training. The next person we have as a member of the working group is a project manager. This is typically a very wide-reaching project. In essence, it touches pretty much everyone in your organization. That being the case, it's very important that we have somebody to coordinate all of the efforts with communications, reaching out to the Active Directory team, working with IT operations to provision servers for migration rigs and for test servers. And just to go, the next person that we have on the list here is the representatives from each function or department. And I preface this with qualified specifically here because in many cases organizations that I've worked with have elected to put forth executive assistance types to represent a department. Although this could potentially work, that there's obviously a tremendous amount of value in having people that are tenured in understanding the organizational hierarchy, the content and its evolution over time, and making sure that we get these qualified resources as a part of the working group really ensures the project's success. The last square that we have in the chart here is executive sponsorship. We at Netwoven definitely understand that executive sponsorship at the highest level of your organization is not always something easy to obtain. You can potentially succeed without it. However, it's tremendously more difficult to do so than if you do. Many of us as IT professionals understand the value in providing an efficient and non-confusing collaboration and content storage platform. However, conveying the value of this to senior executives is not always a no-brainer. And this is something that we at Netwoven have helped many of our clients achieve through correct orientation and messaging. And securing this top-down support is really, really important to get the commitment of those qualified representatives from each of the functions and departments. Once we're able to assemble this team, you've got a recipe for success. Okay, so the next big step is once we have assembled that team, we need to actually educate that team to get everybody on the level playing field. Some of these bullets might seem a bit ridiculous to you, but please bear with me as I run through them. The first important thing for us to cover is the collaboration strategy. People need to know why is this project important. And not everybody is going to understand why it is so important to correctly spend all of this time to build your information architecture, comb through all this information, all the details we're going to go through. And people will potentially complain and drag their feet. I've found that specifically discussing the current siloed nature of information and email and file shares and other systems and the negative impact that that has on the collaborative efficiency and the ability to leverage and reuse past knowledge is typically an effective argument to get some of the stragglers really understanding why this project is important. The next one we have on here, which again might sound a bit funny, but what is SharePoint? Many times I've found that this is a buzzword around the organization. It's kind of slated as a solution to fix everything under the kitchen sink. Maybe, how do I understand what my wife really means? How can I get my husband to remember to put down the toilet seat? Whatever it is, for some reason people say, oh, SharePoint will fix the problem. So you need to make sure that the working group really does have a working knowledge of fundamentally what SharePoint is, and try and move away from the vague, esoteric buzzword to something that's tangible that people really get, and that makes the project work. We have to get everybody on the same page about what information architecture is and why that's important. Even the topics of permissions, inheritance, and groups is something that not everybody gets right away. Trying to draw some parallels to things that people are used to, like file shares, usually very much helps in getting everybody on the same page with understanding why this is important. We have to talk about site templates so we can leverage some templatized way of allowing the team to automate some of your provisioning of content and sites and containers and things that come along in the future. This is very important with the can and should. Although there's many different things that we can do with branding, there are many things that we shouldn't do with branding. And in a lot of cases, when you're thinking about the larger picture of your Office 365 strategy or your cloud strategy, you also have to bring into account that there's other pieces, there's Exchange, there's Link, there's other cloud services, and you need to make sure that there's somewhat of a consistency in that branding. And then the last piece is governance. We're not going to make a significant investment in any organization in getting a collaboration strategy right only to see it fall apart. So you need to make sure when you're working with the working group that the team does understand the importance of setting these rules and processes in place so that your plan is correctly executed and followed after it's put into place.
Hey, Drew?
Yep.
Got a quick question as you're going through here, and I'll be more direct than the question came in. But have you ever had to fire one of your team members, one of the steering committee or guiding piece, or how do you work through when some members are not the most appropriate? I guess that's the question.
Yes, I mean, we've definitely been in a situation where we've had to replace people in the steering committee before. Sometimes it was due to other project commitments. Sometimes it was due to just a lack of understanding of the importance of the project. But that's really where that executive sponsorship comes into play. So we've basically bubbled that up, worked with the executive sponsors to make sure that that function appropriately understood the need to supply somebody that was actually able to fulfill the role. We made that replacement, and the project moved forward smoothly.
Great, thanks.
All right. So the next big section here is pre-migration analysis. There's a number of different reports that allow you to understand the current state of your source system, as well as some potential areas for concern and focused effort. Once we go ahead and get some of the reported data that's listed on the deck here, you're able to analyze its output. And there's a number of exercises related to mapping and configuration that come into play so that you can remove as much manual intervention at the actual time of migration as possible. The last thing you want to do is run into issues while you're midstream in migration, because it breaks up the continuity of what you're doing and ends up having huge timeline impacts. As far as all the reports and pieces that we're talking about up here, I strongly recommend that you consider purchasing a migration tool. There's a number of established players in this area that have spent many years working to perfect their trade. Comparatively, the prices for these tools are very reasonable as compared to developing something in-house. We have had clients that have chosen otherwise to actually build something rather than purchase something. And in every case that's happened, at least for a SharePoint to SharePoint Online migration, the decision was completely backtracked to purchasing an off-the-shelf solution after realizing how non-trivial coding these solutions are and the huge number of variations and settings that you need to handle. So I know firsthand, not only from this experience, but also from playing an active role in developing a custom migration utility from Jive to SharePoint Online, that there's so many nuances, there's so many odd situations that if you have an opportunity to take something off the shelf, it's well worth your investment to do that. Okay. So in our Prepare PyWedge, we have our next topic of data cleansing. So typically when we're getting into migrations, I think everybody notices that there's a wealth of not so useful knowledge in your source system. We don't really want to be spending 8 months migrating 10-year-old policies. Somebody's recorded video of a World Cup game, or pictures from my barbecue that I decided to store in your organization's SharePoint. I assume the answer to whether we want to migrate that content is probably no. You only want to move over your relevant content, and you want to minimize the time and cost that it takes to move to SharePoint Online. Data cleansing is really your #1 way of doing that. Without even focusing on the increase in findability due to the decluttering exercise, I've had clients save weeks or even months off their potential migration schedule, which adds up to tens of thousands of dollars, by making a concerted effort to go ahead and not only clean up the content, but also take a survey of the permissions that are in the source system. If you have your permissions model an absolute mess, it does greatly increase the amount of time that it takes to migrate your content. So making a decision to kind of actively clean that up, or when your team's providing the logic for the migration, to just say, don't move over the permissions the way that they're set. Let's go ahead and reset back to an inherited model and simplify things, allowing us to maybe start over from a clean slate. It's not always the case that you can do that, but many times it is. Okay, so that's the Prepare wedge. The next piece that we're going to go into is discussing information architecture and governance, and we'll start out with the information architecture piece. So, architecture is a very difficult thing to crowdsource or design after the fact. It's typically a job of a collective few people up front, and the job is to define a framework for which all of your organization's content will fit into. If we take an analogy of talking about constructing a building, you typically need an architect to define a solid foundation that can hold up the building. We may want to have elevators that stop on every floor and not just some of them. You're probably going to want to run electricity to all the units, etc. A lack of doing this upfront design ends up allowing for chaos and organic growth. If you think about all the people moving into a building, or all the people that are working on it, coming together and just deciding that they want to build whatever they want to build at the time without having a blueprint to work from, I'm sure you can imagine that wouldn't work out very well. We have the exact same situation here in SharePoint when we're defining the architecture that we're going to put our information in. The effort here is to make sure that we end up creating a situation in which it's very easy to determine where the users of the system should actually put their content, and also how to find that, whether that be navigating to the content or searching for the content. And it's the case that with every single company, with every single vertical, there's obviously going to be some differences in how exactly your navigation, your site structure, your classification taxonomy, how all of this stuff works. But in the end, I've found after working with a number of different organizations that there actually is a common foundation that for an overwhelming majority of situations works as a solid foundation that you can build from. And what I'd like to do next is go ahead and show you that. So there's quite a bit of information on this slide, and don't worry, the deck will be available after the presentation here. But just to go through this quickly, I have included the intranet home section to be complete. I'm going to go ahead and actually leave this out of most of the conversation today because we at Netwoven are typically finding that the most valuable upfront investment is in more of the collaborative area of the information architecture, and that typically this kind of published intranet portal section is something that comes along a bit later. There's a section for My Sites in OneDrive for Business. Although this is a very valuable and important part of your collaboration strategy, there's not a whole lot to think about here from an information architecture perspective because it really is what it is. You have a site collection per user, and then you have a root site collection that kind of ties it all together. So we're going to focus on the three core pillars here, the communities, teams, and the projects or inter-team collaboration. To start with the communities and projects section, for each of them, we have this templated plan has a root site collection. In this case, we can see here that we've got sites communities, and we've got sites projects here. The communities one is typically a community portal site collection. This is a site definition that's offered out of the box in SharePoint Online, and it offers you a nice search-based capability to index all of your communities. And communities are typically a non-organizational hierarchy-aligned group. Could be, your Malbec wine enthusiast group. It could be a Toastmasters club. It could be a Mac users group. Something of that sort that's not necessarily aligned exactly to your organizational hierarchy. And you'll also see here that there's a number of different sections here. So you'll see that we've got this members community 1, members community 2. We've got open and private communities here as well. The point is that when we have communities, there's different types of them. It may be the case that we have certain ones that we want anybody in the company to be able to join into without any barrier of restriction. There's also ones where we may want everybody in the company to be able to see the information, but not necessarily contribute to it unless they have been approved by somebody who owns and manages that community. And that's our membership communities. The last is our private communities, and typically these could have more sensitivity to the information, could potentially be something to do with M&A or whatever it is, but something that you don't want anybody to be able to see. It's literally an invite-only type situation. So similarly with projects, we've got a general and a sensitive here that allows you to make that distinction between things that are maybe more open to the internal public and those that are more of an invite-only situation. The common glue across these two, though, is that rather than having deep hierarchical structures, these subsites that we see here are typically all siblings of each other. There can be some sort of hierarchy here, but the point is that rather than making it confusing for people to figure out, okay, which department does this project belong to? Where am I supposed to put it? Where do I find it? A project is a project, and we assign it to departments in our site directory here. So without diving into too much more detail on this, this is something that we definitely go through in the workshops that we do. The communities and projects are more of a flat type structure. And then the other section that we have here is the teams area. The teams area can also have a route to kind of tie all of your different departments together. And then you have site collections that you create on a per function basis. And in each of these site collections, they'll likely have a deep site structure, many times that mimics the structure of your organization. There are some specific recommendations that we have around where you make that choice of breaking a site collection to a site to allow for minimal reworking of your information architecture in the case of organizational change. But I think, again, that's probably a bit more detail than we'll get into today. But these are kind of the core tenets of a template that you can use to start your information architecture, and then you can expand beyond this to fit the rest of the needs of your vertical or your organization into the footprint that gives you that framework to put your content into. All right? The next big piece when we're talking about information architecture, we just talked site structure, is navigation. We need to make sure that we tie all of those different areas of the information architecture together. And the way in which we do this is to make sure that users don't get pigeonholed into silos as they navigate around. I could be, in my intranet home. I could be, at one of the project sites. I could be at the community site. And I want to see something like this, which allows me to kind of quickly jump to the other tenets or the other core tenets of my SharePoint Online implementation. Whereas when I get into a team site, it's probably more relevant for me to be able to see some of the site structure and have that built organically based on the parent-child relationship of all the sites. But at the same time, I don't want to lose the context and have the person completely stuck in this IT area. You want to enforce a policy to say, hey, you're only one click away from getting back up to somewhere where you can see all the way across. So this is not a hard and fast rule, but the point is you keep your users, no matter where they are, only a couple clicks away from anywhere that they want to go. They never get lost, and they can always bubble back up without having to rely on their back and forward browser buttons. Okay. And then the last section here in information architecture is classification taxonomy. After we define the site collection and site structure and provide a cohesive navigation across them, we have to think a little bit about classification taxonomy or metadata. So this topic is typically much more difficult to define and implement than the previous two. And I found that taking the approach I'm going to show here is something that is effective to get the process started. You typically ask the working group, consider whether you have any organizational-wide tagging requirements. This, in many cases, is a limited set. We've seen situations where companies wanted to define a security classification for all of the content that they create so that policies can be run against this information that's been required. It could be an expiration date. It could be a number of different things, but there's usually a smaller list of these. After that, and typically when you're working on defining some of your site templates that we'll get into a little bit later, you can think about some more specific cases. We worked with a company here in the Bay Area that their project management office decided that they wanted to use what they called project phase gates to allow them to efficiently track and report on their projects in progress. So we needed to build some specific taxonomy to go ahead and support that. I'm not going to dive into too much detail on this today because this is a fairly dense subject in and of itself. And in my experience, most organizations actually table this to later phases of their implementation. So really don't worry if this is not something of essence immediately. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, So we're going to jump to next section here under IA and governance, and that's site provisioning, branding templates, and governance. So Microsoft and I both strongly recommend leveraging a provider-hosted custom site provisioning application. This offers you a number of great features. You have a bench to actually work off of. Some of the Microsoft Consulting Services team put together a project on Codeplex called the AMS Codeplex project that actually allows you to have a framework that you can build off of to really start this application. They wanted to jumpstart people's ability to get into this, and what they've offered is fairly complex, or complete, I should say. There's a number of advantages to using this method. And although the barrier to entry is actually relatively low, I have actually seen in my experience that a number of organizations are skipping over this important application. It offers you some great things like being able to automate the governance rules for site creation. You can even include workflows so that people have to approve site creation or say exactly where it's meant to be created. This comes into play typically when you're creating sites in that deeper team structure. I'm going to go ahead and show a way that you can, I'm going to actually show a way that you can work around this. However, Netwoven is currently working on templatizing the building of something above and beyond this AMS Codeplex project to even further lower the barrier to entry here. And I strongly recommend that you consider looking into a site provisioning app rather than going another approach because of the extra features that it offers. So the other method for handling the site creation process is related to web templates. There are a ton of potential concerns and pitfalls in implementing this approach because the web templates are declarative in their method of creating the sites. There's a lot of things that don't happen with the code that typically runs after you activate features or when you create something from some of the out-of-the-box templates. You need to make sure that you understand these details. There is a way to make this work almost 100%, but I would strongly recommend that before you employ that approach, make sure that you talk to somebody who does understand those pitfalls. Okay, so a recommendation here on branding. One of the first things that we at Netwoven always advise our clients is to make sure to centralize as much as you can of your branding components. There are ways of deploying your branding that ends up kind of placing these pieces of content in every site collection in your tenant. I strongly recommend that you centralize that so that when you make changes in the future, it is fairly easy to make those updates because it is in a single location. Also strongly recommend, like we said before with the can and should of branding, that you make sure to minimize on what should be done and try as much as you can to, I guess, work within the confines of SharePoint's theming framework. There are some limitations to what it can do, but at the same time, it does offer, a fair breadth in branding leeway. And many times I've found that organizations are happy to work within that, and this can help with a number of different things. I've actually been in situations where Microsoft support has decided to actually completely close and not help on a case because it was caused by some branding that was quite extensive, and the company was told that they needed to figure it out themselves. So it's definitely valuable to play within the box here. And the last piece here is that in our collaboration sites, many times we're not using the publishing feature of SharePoint. And the publishing feature allows us to have a centralized set of components so that your browser's caching does a lot of the job of speeding up the page load. When we have collaboration sites, you don't necessarily have all of these central components. We do have some if we centralize our branding here, but there's many pieces that get loaded within each site as a separate URL. And because your browser's cache can't handle that for you, Microsoft rolled out the minimal download strategy, which effectively does this on the server side. However, it's quite easy to break this if you're not careful with what you're doing with your customizations. So make sure that after you make your customizations, that you do make sure your minimal download strategy is working as expected to keep your page load time down. Okay? So I'm not going to dive too much into this. I think that we have talked about a lot of different topics related to governance in the previous slides. The only thing I want to say here is that we have a complete set of governance topics that we typically cover in the course of a migration project, and just make sure that this is something that you do invest your time in, you make a priority on the project. Without it, all of this work that you've done ends up going to nothing over the course of time. Okay, our next section is migration logic capture and analysis. This is where we're really getting into the meat of working with the business teams. There's a couple of different approaches that I've seen organizations try to take here for executing a migration. And typically the question that comes up is, why can't I just let my site owners do this on their own accord? And to be honest with you, there's a number of reasons why that's not a good idea. You can purchase these migration tools and you can allow the end users to go ahead and migrate content themselves, which can potentially work in some small cases. But typically when you're doing a large migration from a source to target system, that especially in those team areas of the information architecture that we discussed a minute ago, there's a lot of value to having one or a couple of people define that information architecture. The same way I talked about before that crowdsourcing that doesn't typically make sense. If you go ahead and let all 300 site owners inside the IT site collection decide where they want to move their sites to, you're going to end up with a huge mess of multiple branches that should be single ones, duplicate sites that should have been merged, all sorts of things like that. So making sure that you have a person who is a content owner from each of these different functional areas is extremely important to make sure you end up with a structure that actually makes sense in the end. When we do it this way and we send out, our Netwoven's migration logic sheets that we've created, it allows you to gather that information from your teams, bring that in, and have somebody validated who really gets, what the migration is about, understanding the nuances of some of the responses that come in and catching issues that otherwise wouldn't be the case. You let a site owner completely have at the tool themselves, you don't have that extra layer of validation. Things just happen. We can actually save some money on the migration tools, so a lot of times, you do pay per seat to have some of these tools available to you. So if we go ahead and farm out the capture of the logic, but centralize the execution of the migration, you can save a considerable amount of money on the tooling. And then lastly, we ourselves have built something like this, and obviously anybody else would be capable of doing it. But once you've organized and captured the logic from the team to say, I want to move this site to this target, migrate the permissions, don't migrate the navigation, there's a whole number of configurations and details we capture, that we've actually built a process by which you can completely automate the migration and run it multi-threaded to have a maximum throughput, all from that logic sheet that you've captured the information from the business on. So hopefully that explains a number of reasons why it definitely makes sense to centralize the capture of this migration logic.
Hey, Drew?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for going through that. There was a couple of questions that came in. One, just a reminder, just like all our webinars, our webinar content will be available on the netwoven.com events page. So please, you'll get a chance to see, get that information there. But the other question that came in was, I know, in terms of moving to the cloud, it's a little bit different than migrating on-premise. And when you talk about this migration mapping logic as well as just sheer moving the data, can you talk a little bit about what's different when moving to the cloud, throttling and those kinds of things?
Yeah, definitely. So To be honest, I mean, I'd heard things about throttling in the past, but I have not really seen anything with Microsoft actually throttling a migration. Typically, when you're throttling, you're talking about code running within your site collections. But one thing that we've typically done in our our engagements with some of our larger clients is proactively work with the Office 365 support team or through your organization's TAM to go ahead and make sure that they're aware of what's happening and that they can potentially even align a support resource to be available if there are any issues or if there is something weird happens with throttling. But definitely, like you said, well, with the migrations to SharePoint Online versus on-prem, we obviously can't do an in-place upgrade. We are moving content from one system to another. And most of the tools, even the ones that they're using for on-prem now, are typically going to more agentless tools that work across the client-side object model. There are potential other situations where you can actually extract database information, put that up into Azure, and have an agent that works against that database to then create CSOM calls to write into SharePoint. So there's a couple of different approaches. We've typically seen the most success with working with these agentless tools, and it's pretty impressive what they can do these days. I mean, typically when an organization downloads them and plays with them for a few minutes, they're getting a couple hundred megabytes per hour of throughput. Netwoven has been able to achieve up to 3 gigs an hour, and one of the companies that we partner with recently just made some big changes, and they're boasting up to 10 gigs per hour right now. So I think we need to do a little bit of work to go ahead and play with those new releases that have been let out in the last week or so. But there's some very promising throughput as well as features available from the tools.
That does bring up a good point. Migration, not only getting the sites created, but migration does take a significant time if you're moving large volumes of data. And good news is these tools are improving.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Drew.
All right. So I'm going to try and speed up here a little bit. I know we're kind of running up on time, so we're going to talk about proactively tackling migration errors and omissions. So despite the fact that the migration tools are fairly mature, like I said, many of these companies have been doing this for years, I've yet to find one that can actually capture all of its own errors and omissions. So with that being the case, you want to make sure that you avoid putting yourself in an endless support situation with trying to find issues after the fact or just doing a small survey across some sample sets of data. Automate the testing. We at Netwoven have actually built some tools around the Selenium testing suite. We've been able to run very high resource testing rig servers with multi-threaded automated testing to actually test a full 100% of the content that you migrate. Not to say that we test to see that every single word or character is in a document, but we count things like lists, libraries, configurations, views, versions, all of the things on the slide here. This gives you a very high level of confidence that your migration was successful, rather than you just sitting there crossing your fingers hoping that what you got in your error log is actually everything that had an issue. The next section we'll talk about here is broken links. We've seen in a number of cases at Netwoven and with the clients that we work with that this is something that's overlooked. You have many embedded links inside your binary documents, your Word files, your PDFs, your PowerPoints. You also have them in the content on your page of your SharePoint sites, your wiki pages, or whatever your source system is. There's a number of different ways you can approach handling the fact that those links are no longer going to work after you migrate your content. The two that I've got on the slide here, one is to actually permanently fix those links. So there are a number of players in that game that offer tooling that will actually go through and change the content within your documents. There are some potential concerns there that can change the authorship data of the content to say that it was modified more recently than you really want it to, when all you've really done is fix a link to handle an issue caused by a migration. There's potential issues with it covering all of the file types that you need it to be covered. It can be fairly time-consuming and expensive to actually run through that process. And like I said, it requires some specialized tooling. You do have to reach out to a partner to do that because there's different filters required to parse out each of these different files and actually make those changes. So something that we've seen a little bit more traction with, and we've built this on Microsoft's IIS platform as well as in Apache on Linux, is to create a URL redirection module. So although this requires some ongoing support after the solution, it is fairly low because these are kind of, they're built on core platform things like Apache and IIS that you don't necessarily have a whole ton of maintenance to deal with. The cost is comparatively low, and what it does is it actually supports redirecting all of your links for the links that point back to your old system into the new location in the target system. So we have definitely found that with our ability to package this and lower the costs right now, that it's a very valuable thing to consider including in your migration. It is extremely frustrating when users click on links that are broken, and this allows you to completely avoid that headache. Okay, next section here is about change management. We're going to start out with estimating and managing your migration timeline. First off, we're going to talk about our process flow here. So a typical migration at a high level, we're very much focused on making sure that we minimize the blackout windows. We don't want to have any extended period of time in which we tell users that they can't put data into either the source or the target system while we're finalizing the details of the migration. Like we said, we want to make sure that we automate as much as possible, and we want to continually reinforce what we're doing through a unified set of communications. So we've talked about starting out with a pre-migration analysis and the migration logic capture. Now, once that's done, the terminology I typically use here is a full migration. What this means is that at a certain point in time, we're going to go ahead and migrate all of the content that was in your source system to the new SharePoint Online tenant. And as we do that in waves, you're going to want to consider doing things like automating the testing and including your business users in QAing the results of that migration as you go through it. If you break it into this and then what is typically called a delta or an incremental migration, what you can do is very much minimize the amount of time that you need for a blackout window, like I mentioned in the focus area, because the delta, the new or changed content in the time period between the start and end of the full migration is significantly smaller than, in most cases, it's significantly smaller than the full set of content that you're migrating over. So breaking it into these two kind of iterative steps here is extremely important to minimizing that downtime. And then once you're done, you're tested and everything looks good, you switch on your URL redirection module and go live. So I'm going to go ahead and skip over most of this, but I think that the point is here that managing a timeline in any project is extremely important. But obviously, when we have a project, or when you have a project that's touching every single department and person in your organization, in most cases, it becomes paramount. There's some details here about calculating the throughput. I mean, some of the calculations here are fairly straightforward, but you need to make sure that you spend the time during that pre-migration analysis period to do some sampling of migrations, do some proof of concepts, because like I said before, there are a number of things that affect the time that it takes to migrate. It's not just the amount of content. It's also some of the details about the permissions and the way they're set up, and you need to make sure that you have an accurate sampling of the way that your content is put together and some of the expectations around the migration logic configurations that are coming in from your team to make sure that you can accurately estimate this timeline. And then obviously once that migration logic is in and complete, then you can very much narrow this down to to a science. Okay, let's go ahead and keep moving, see if we can get to the Q&A. So there's a section here in communications plan. I'm not going to go into every detail here. We at Netwoven do have a fairly complete set of communication plan practices to make sure that your team is aware. Again, with this being so far-reaching, it's extremely important to unify your communications, but also make sure that they're coming from a number of different angles so that nobody can say in the end that they were not notified that this is happening. And in general, I think that making sure that the team understands the overall strategy of what's happening is extremely important. I think there's a big push in organizations these days to, rather than focus so much on the best system for every last detail of what you need to do in your organization, that there's actually more value to having something like a SharePoint or another 3CS platform where the collaboration strategy is understood. It's a single system. People know where to go. You can still break up the information into the different core tenets that we talked about in the information architecture, but people don't have to decide, am I going to this system? Am I going to that system? Where am I supposed to put this content? Do I look in a file share? They understand that there's a core strategy, and if you make sure that's a very important and integral part of your communication and adoption plan, that it just makes the whole system move a lot more smoothly. It allows your team to collaborate more efficiently, and I think you'll see some very nice benefits of making sure that's an important part. So, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and just skip over the last here. Are there a number of questions that would be worthwhile us jumping to a Q&A on?
Yeah, I think, well, you can go ahead and finish this out real quick, and then we'll just do a recap. We've got a few more minutes here, so.
Okay. So yeah, so I think there's some important pieces here. Make sure that you have these questions answered as you're working through the process of the migration. You need to make sure that adoption is not something that's an afterthought. It should be a core thread throughout the entire project. So make sure that your team can leverage the investment that you're making in this new platform and the move there to the fullest, and include this as a theme and a thread throughout the entire project. Okay, back to you, Walt.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Drew. A lot of topics you covered. Some of them got a chance to explain some real-world challenges that we've had. Well, now for the next piece, one of the important parts, I know that we appreciate many of you investing the time to be on this webinar, and we'd like to, if you can go to the next slide, we have a couple things that we want to share. One, we definitely think that there's these 5 areas that you've got a chance to walk through, Drew, are very helpful. We do spend time with our customers, even to just give them the information architecture workshop, working with on migration strategy review, even a migration POC. 3 things that are easy things that we could potentially help you with, and at least give you the confidence about moving forward with the migration to Office 365. So definitely things to consider. If there's ways we can help you, you'll have some information at the end on how to reach us. 2 other things before we wrap up here. We thank you again for participating. We do have an Amazon gift card available for those that was on the webinar until now. And in fact, I think, Rashi, we have a winner. So it's August Hartono from Sutter Health. So thank you for joining, and we'll send you a quick email, and hopefully we'll be able to send you this gift card as soon as we can. The last thing, just to transition, Drew, is we do have a couple of pending questions, so I'm going to throw it out there, Drew, and others, Viraj and Matt, to see some of the feedback that you guys have. One is, you think about some of the large application migration or large migrations that you work on. Besides the topics you covered, are there some real-world feedback that you can give advice to the team about? Anything that you didn't cover that you really want to kind of share, Drew?
Off the top of my head, no. I tried to cover most of the the big topics here. I mean, I'd be happy to get into some more details.
There was one that came in. Sorry, Drew, I didn't mean to be so vague. There was one about data cleansing, and I know you had some examples. They were just trying to get a sense of the rough percentages of what some kind of when you're going through that cleansing, in your experience, how much can they expect to clean up and not migrate? Is there any averages you've seen on some of your projects?
I mean, it's very organization dependent, but I mean, with some of the ones that I'm planning on right now, I mean, we're looking at 7 to 8 terabytes of total content, and I think we're expecting to move 3 or 4 after the cleansing. So, I mean, you can take a very sizable chunk of information out of systems. I mean, there are some organizations that, they're a bit better with dispositioning over time, but, there's many companies I've worked with who are hesitant to delete anything. And this ends up being your perfect opportunity to get rid of all of the old things that have, nothing but kind of legal issues attached to them now that you may as well want to clean up. Or, like I said, I mean, it could just be things like pictures of somebody's barbecue or something like that. Seen all sorts of weird stuff in SharePoint.
And Drew, I know storage is not it's relatively cheap, but it has an incremental cost for a lot of the online pieces. Any feedback on that?
Yeah. So I mean, not only is there a fairly significant impact on the time it takes to do the migration, but yes, when you pay for your organization's tenancy, you get a base storage allocation, and then you get a per user addition on top of that. So although it's not terribly expensive, there is a cost associated with having unnecessary extra storage in your SharePoint Online system.
Good. Well, thanks, Drew. We're coming up to the hour. I appreciate your time. I appreciate all the customers and other partners that are on the call for joining. If you look for the netwoven.com/events, you'll see you'll have access to this webinar content, as well as if you go to the next page, I think we also have our blogs page where many of these topics are covered. So thanks again for your time, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.